I moved to another state, and my daughter-in-law didn't even notice. Months later, she learned about my financial situation. Suddenly, a message appeared on my phone. Transfer me $16,000. There are moments in life when you realize you've been downgraded to a piece of furniture in your own home. For me, that realization hit on a rainy Tuesday evening in November. I was sitting at the kitchen table of the house I built and paid for in Boston, while my daughter-in-law Vanessa and my son Julian sat on the couch across the room. They were talking about me as if I were a ghost. Vanessa was already mapping out how to convert my cozy reading room into a private home office for herself. Julian just nodded along silently the way he always did whenever his wife spoke. After my husband passed away 3 years ago, the two of them moved into the upper floor of my house. At first, I thought it was a practical arrangement, a way to stay close. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, Vanessa had taken over the entire place. My home didn't feel like mine anymore. I was 64 years old, in great shape, and nowhere near ready to be pushed into a corner. Yet Vanessa treated me like a built-in maid and a free on-call babysitter for the grandkids. If dinner wasn't on the table the minute they walked in, there would be these passive-aggressive biting remarks. My own life didn't matter. That evening, something shifted inside me. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just quietly stood up, poured myself a glass of water, and went to my bedroom. The next morning, I took control. The deed to the house was solely in my name, but we still shared an old bank account from Julian's college days. I pulled up the statements and noticed Vanessa had been quietly using it to fund her online shopping. They weren't massive amounts, but it was a total breach of trust. I revoked Julian's access to my savings that very morning. It was a small, silent first step. They thought I was old, distracted, and easily managed. They were wrong. I spent the next few weeks planning my exit with absolute discretion. Vanessa was far too wrapped up in her own world and her social media feeds to notice that my side of the house was changing. I packed my personal belongings, old photo albums, and family keepsakes into plain cardboard boxes. My destination was set. I was moving down to North Carolina, where a close childhood friend was renting out a beautiful, independent cottage. I desperately needed to breathe. Julian spent all his time at work or staring at his phone so he didn't suspect a thing. One Saturday, while they took the kids out for a weekend trip, the moving truck pulled up to my driveway. 3 hours later, my first-floor apartment was completely empty. I didn't leave a dramatic note. Instead, I just left a neatly typed sheet of new house rules on the kitchen counter, along with a revised utility agreement stating they would now be responsible for 100% of the bills. I turned my key in the lock, stepped outside, and hit the road. Driving south felt like taking my first real breath after living in a fog for years. I settled into my new place in North Carolina quickly. It was incredibly peaceful. But the most stunning part, days went by and my phone didn't ring once. Neither my son nor my daughter-in-law even noticed that the entire first floor of the house was vacant. They were living in their own little bubble, using the kitchen, probably assuming I was out gardening or running errands. It wasn't until the 4th day that my phone finally buzzed. It was a text from Vanessa. No greeting, no hope you're doing well. She just asked where I hid the laundry detergent. I smiled to myself, put the phone face down, and went about my day. They had completely forgotten I was a human being. But reality was about to knock on their door. It took almost 2 full weeks for Julian and Vanessa to understand that I wasn't coming back. Julian finally called me sounding completely lost and overwhelmed. He asked where I was and why all my furniture was gone. I told him as calmly as if I were talking about the weather, that I had relocated to North Carolina to live my own life. There was no screaming match, just a statement of fact. Julian couldn't quite grasp the gravity of the change, but Vanessa soon would. Without me around, Their routine crumbled. There was no one to pick the kids up from school, no one to clean up the common areas, and no one to have dinner waiting for them. Suddenly, they had to manage their own lives, and their house of cards was beginning to wobble. But Vanessa was far too proud to apologize. She chose to ignore my absence entirely, acting as if nothing had happened. 5 months passed in absolute silence. I loved my new life, took long walks, and made new friends. Meanwhile, back in Boston, a storm was brewing. Vanessa's boutique clothing shop, which she ran with a lot of pride, but very little financial literacy, was on the verge of bankruptcy. She had alienated her suppliers and ignored her bills. Julian's salary couldn't cover the mounting debt. Then, through a mutual acquaintance, Vanessa found out that I had recently liquidated an old stock portfolio my late husband and I had built. My bank account was looking very healthy. Suddenly, I wasn't the annoying, invisible mother-in-law anymore. I was a walking ATM. On a Friday morning, a text popped up on my screen that left me completely stunned. No, how are you? No pleasantries. Just a single sentence from Vanessa. Transfer me $16,000 immediately, or we're going to lose the boutique. The entitlement was breathtaking. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity. Vanessa honestly believed she could freeze me out for months and then demand the price of a used car on a whim. She thought family obligation was a weapon she could use to extract my cash. But I was done being a doormat. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. I put together a detailed spreadsheet covering the last 3 years. Every single hour I spent packing shipping boxes for her boutique, every drive to the wholesale market, every week, I watched the kids full-time so they could go on vacation. I applied a standard conservative market rate to every single task. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a business transaction. If Vanessa wanted to treat family as a resource to exploit, then we would play by those exact rules. The final sum at the bottom of the ledger was staggering. My years of uncompensated labor had a real dollar value. I saved the document as a PDF. That evening, I texted her back a brief reply regarding your request for $16,000. Please review the attached itemized statement of your outstanding balance with me. Once my invoice is settled in full, we can discuss future financial arrangements. I attached the PDF and hit send. It was just past 8 p.m. It took exactly 3 minutes for my phone to start blowing up. Vanessa tried calling, followed immediately by Julian. I didn't answer. I put the phone on silent, watered my plants, and went to bed early. The power dynamic had shifted, and they hadn't even realized it yet. The next morning, my phone was a graveyard of 15 missed calls and a tidal wave of text messages. Vanessa was unhinged. Her texts cycled through different emotions every few minutes, moving from mocking laughter to vicious insults followed by dramatic accusations that I was ruining my own grandchildren's lives. Julian sent a separate text begging me to be reasonable and not to provoke his wife. I made a cup of coffee and watched the sun come up. It was amazing how little the digital screaming affected me. The emotional blackmail that used to keep me up at night completely lost its power. Around noon, Julian called again. This time, I picked up and put him on speakerphone while I washed the breakfast dishes. "Mom, what are you doing?" he cried, sounding entirely defeated. "Vanessa has been crying for hours. You can't send a bill to your own family. This is insane," I replied, keeping my voice completely level. Julian Vanessa didn't ask for help. She issued a demand for a wire transfer. She treated me like a vendor. I simply responded with a statement of accounts. In the background, I could hear Vanessa screaming at the top of her lungs. "Tell your selfish mother that we're going to lose the house if the shop goes under." I paused for a second. The house in Boston was entirely in my name. They were living there rent-free, only paying utilities. Vanessa still thought she held the cards. "The house belongs to me, Vanessa," I said, projecting my voice so she could hear me clearly through the phone. And that brings us to my next point. An immediate suffocating silence fell over the line. The silence didn't last long, followed by a sharp gasp from my son. In their arrogance, they had completely forgotten that legally, they were just guests in my property. My husband and I had spent decades paying off that mortgage while Julian and Vanessa had taken it for granted. "What do you mean by that, Mom?" Julian asked, his voice dropping significantly. I laid it out for him calmly. "You live on the top floor of my house. Since Vanessa is having financial trouble and making demands on my savings, I am changing the living arrangements. I've decided to lease out the first floor, which has been sitting empty since I moved." I heard Vanessa screech in the background. "You can't do that. That's our space. The kids play down there. We were going to use the first floor as a showroom for my boutique." Her entitlement was bulletproof. I remained completely unfazed. The lease for the new tenants is already signed. It's a lovely retired couple. They will be paying rent on the first of every month, something you two have never done. I informed them that the new tenants would have full access to the backyard and that the upper and lower units would be strictly separated. The days of them treating the entire property as their personal estate were over. Vanessa went into a full meltdown, calling me controlling and heartless. Julian tried to plead, but I cut him off. "You have until the first of the month to clear all your belongings out of the lower floor and the basement," I said firmly. "If you need money for the boutique, I suggest you start cutting back on your own lifestyle." I hung up. The news of the new tenants hit them hard, but Vanessa wasn't the type to back down gracefully. Instead of facing reality and downsizing her lifestyle, she decided to cross a line from which there was no return. A week after that phone call, I checked my bank app to review my monthly expenses. My eyes stopped on an authorized debit for exactly $4,500 to a major commercial textile distributor. Vanessa had kept my old banking information from a few years back when I helped her file her business taxes. She had used my routing and account numbers to authorize an electronic payment online. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was fraud. My heart rate spiked, but it wasn't out of fear, it was pure adrenaline. I called my bank's fraud department immediately. Because it was an unauthorized electronic transfer, they reversed the charge with a single click, and the money was back in my account within minutes. But I wasn't going to sit back and wait for her next move. I didn't call the police, and I didn't call a lawyer. I solved the problem directly and permanently. I had the bank close the account entirely and moved all my funds to a completely new institution they had no knowledge of. Then I took a screenshot of the reverse transaction and texted it to Vanessa. I added a brief note. "Nice try. That account is closed. If you ever attempt to touch my money again, I will have the locks on the Boston house changed while you are at work. Go ahead and test me." She didn't reply. For the first time, she realized she was playing a game she couldn't win. On the first of the month, I flew up to Boston. I wanted to be there in person to make sure the transition went smoothly for my new tenants, the manual arts teachers, Ronald and Evelyn. When I arrived at the property, it was an absolute mess. The trash cans hadn't been rolled out to the curb, and Vanessa's business inventory boxes were stacked all over the front porch. Julian and Vanessa stayed upstairs, hiding out and pretending they weren't home. I ignored them completely. I met Ronald and Evelyn, walked them through the first-floor apartment and handed over the keys. They were a quiet, incredibly polite couple who immediately fell in love with the garden. We signed the final paperwork and they began moving their furniture in. The sound of footsteps and activity downstairs finally drew Julian out. He stood on the landing of the stairs, looking small and deeply embarrassed by the entire situation. I could see Vanessa watching us like a hawk from the upstairs window. "Mom," Julian whispered nervously when the tenants stepped out to the truck. Did you really have to do this? It's so awkward. Vanessa is mortified in front of the neighbors. I looked at my son, the man I had raised, who had become so spineless under his wife's thumb. Julian, I said quietly, what's awkward is trying to steal from your own mother. This isn't cruelty. It's accountability. Ronald and Evelyn are covering half the property taxes and home insurance starting today. That actually helps you out. You should be thanking me. He looked down at his shoes, unable to hold my gaze. He knew I was right. Vanessa didn't get her $16,000. She lost control of the house, and the neighbors could see that she was no longer running the show. 2 weeks after the tenants moved in Vanessa's house of cards, Benjali collapsed. Because she couldn't secure the $16,000 and her suppliers cut her off after my bank reversed the fraudulent payment, her boutique went completely under. Her dream of being a glamorous business owner was dead. Julian called me that evening, his voice cracking with emotion. He told me Vanessa had been crying for days and that the banks had frozen their credit cards. They were sitting on a mountain of debt that they now had to pay off solely using Julian's salary. She wants to apologize, Mom, Julian muttered softly. She knows she messed up. Can we please just talk about the money? I sat in my comfortable armchair in North Carolina, looking out at the beautiful green landscape. I didn't feel a drop of pity, but I didn't feel any vindictive joy either. It was just the natural consequence of her own actions. Julian, I said, my voice steady and firm. An apology that only happens because someone ran out of money is completely worthless. She isn't apologizing to me. She's apologizing to my bank account. I made it explicitly clear that I would not be paying off a single dime of their business debt. You can keep living in the upstairs unit as long as you pay your share of the utilities on time. That is the extent of my support. If you can't manage that, you need to find a cheaper apartment. Julian swallowed hard. He finally understood that the days of unconditional bailouts were over. Vanessa had tried to compromise my financial security to save herself, and now she had to learn to live with the fallout. 6 months have passed since that day. The boutique is gone for good, and Vanessa is now working an hourly job at a local grocery store, a position she used to look down on with immense disdain. She has become noticeably quieter. Whenever I fly back to Boston to check on the property or visit with Ronald and Evelyn, Vanessa greets me politely and keeps her distance. She finally understands that my boundaries are made of reinforced concrete. Julian often brings the kids down to North Carolina to visit me by himself. Our relationship is a bit more distant than it used to be, but it's grounded in honesty now. He no longer expects his mother to clean up his financial messes or handle his life. He's finally growing up. I'm still living in North Carolina. My house is bright, my garden is thriving, and my phone has become a sanctuary of peace. There are no more frantic demands, no fraudulent charges, and no emotional manipulation. I didn't destroy my family. I simply stopped subsidizing their mistakes and tolerating their disrespect. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people you love is to hand them the exact invoice for their own behavior. My life belongs to me again. Every dollar in my account is secure. But more importantly, I have my peace back. And that is worth every single cent.